people that worked with Rife weren't amateurs. I mean, Dr. Rosenau was called one of the greatest bacteriologists in the history of the Mayo Clinic. Dr. Kendall was referred to as America's Pasteur. Now, some people might consider that an insult, but nonetheless, that's the highest honor that one could be accorded. Dr. Milbank Johnson was head of the local medical society in California. Some of the physicists, I think Coolidge assisted him. We've had reports that C.P. Steinmetz assisted him with some of the work. Even Lee DeForest, who is credited with inventing the vacuum tube triode, was reportedly involved with Rife. So these people knew what they were doing, and I think if they weren't really impressed with what Rife was doing, I don't think they would have stayed with him as long as they did.
For what I've been able to determine, Kendall, Rosenau, Johnson, and other people like this were all top of their field. They were well respected within their field of medicine here in the United States. Dr. Kendall, he was certainly a tremendous bacteriologist, as was Dr. Rosenau. All these people were well published, highly respected. Rosenau was head of his department in the Mayo Clinic, for goodness sakes. This is not a minor position to be appointed to. Dr. Johnson was well respected at the University of Southern California, and he certainly was an individual well respected within his own medical community where he worked. He was able to, just by asking people through his influence and their respect for him as an individual and credibility, get other medical doctors involved in this work. I think that says a lot.
On the weekend following the calamitous stock market crash of 1929, Rife emerged into the public eye. The fruits of nearly 20 years of mind-boggling work were presented for the first time in this front-page headline story. Before this time, Rife had worked in private, occasionally seeking consultation with the leading minds in optics and electronics in a drive to perfect his instruments and his laboratory techniques. After the existence of his supermicroscope became widely known, the tables turned, and the experts began seeking consultation with Rife. Some of America's top bacteriologists beat a pathway directly to Rife's lab. There was a major debate raging in microbiology at the time, and it was believed that a microscope like Rife's might just settle it. The debate hinged upon the question of the existence and controversial nature of a certain kind of microorganism, referred to as a filterable form of bacteria, so called because it was so small and plastic that it could pass through the minute pores of a stone filter, too small to be seen with any conventional microscope. These very fine porcelain filters, available in different grades of porosity, are generally used in microbiology to isolate virus-sized microbes. The controversy arose when a number of bacteriologists claimed that they could take a fluid from a growth culture of a large bacteria and, after passing that fluid through a filter and placing the emerging liquid on a culture media, or food, they could cultivate or regrow the original bacteria again. Conventional microbiologists considered this result to be due to leaky filters or contaminated samples, and regarded the notion of a filterable form of bacteria as absurd. However, the findings of some filtrationist microbiologists were much more upsetting than the proposed caterpillar to butterfly type transition between some types of bacteria and their much smaller filterable forms. Some filtrationists had discovered that by changing the food or culture media, they could encourage transitions from one filterable form into many different types of organisms, all of them a different species than the bacteria that originally produced the filterable form. If this were true, it would shake the foundations of microbiology and force a complete rewrite of our textbooks. The man who pioneered this obscure branch of microbiology, known as pleomorphism, was the French pathologist Antoine Beauchamp. In his time, Beauchamp was an authoritative presence, renowned for his exacting laboratory methods, his precise thinking, and his vast knowledge in microbiology. He was one of France's greatest scientists. His contributions included discovering a method of dramatically reducing the cost of producing aniline dye, thereby revolutionizing the entire French garment industry. He discovered the causes of fermentation in 1855. And in 1862, he found the causes of certain rampant diseases of grapes, which were then ravaging the French wine industry. In 1865, he saved the garment industry again by finding the cause of an epidemic disease that was destroying the silkworm population of Europe. Yet, astonishingly, Beauchamp was not credited with his successes. Most of his work, in fact, was plagiarized by a rival French scientist, one Louis Pasteur. It was Louis Pasteur who received recognition for determining that fermentation was caused by a microorganism, and that the silkworm disease was due to a parasite, and that grapes were being consumed by a bacteria. In her book, Beauchamp or Pasteur, historian Ethel Hume demonstrates that these discoveries were absolutely attributed to the wrong man. Beauchamp and Pasteur were rivals, both of them associates at France's academies of science. Even a cursory examination of their discourses and their very public arguments will readily reveal who was the gifted scientist and who was the impostor. Ironically, history has dubbed Louis Pasteur as the founder of the germ theory of disease, the idea that infection is the primary pathway to illness, a paradigm that rose and endured more out of political considerations than through an unbiased scientific inquiry. Beauchamp was investigating a proposition that was much more complex than a simple infection model. In essence, Beauchamp believed that the emerging germ theory of disease was incomplete. Beauchamp's exacting techniques in the laboratory had revealed what he believed to be an elementary living particle. He called it the microzyma, an extremely tiny living organism capable of transforming into many different pathogenic forms as a result of changes in the chemical makeup of its host environment. With Beauchamp's discovery of this tendency for his so-called microzyma to change forms, the study of pleomorphism was founded. Whereas Pasteur is remembered for his germ theory of disease, which is arguably not even his original theory, Beauchamp and his theory of pleomorphism has been generally forgotten. But not by everyone, not by a growing number of microbiologists who have taken the time to experiment with new culture mediums, advanced microscopes, and living specimens. Dr. Arthur Isaac Kendall was a filtrationist. He believed he had found the very media that would allow bacteria to transform into their tiny, filterable state. He called it the K media.
And this is where one of Reif's collaborators was very well known back in those times. The Kendall media, the K media. I don't know what all was in it, but the contents, the specific contents of media would influence what the growth patterns would be, or the lack of growth.
Dr. Kendall was in need of a special microscope himself for the work that he was doing, so he contacted an associate in California, Dr. Milbank Johnson, and asked him if such a microscope actually existed. So upon inquiry, Dr. Johnson found out that in fact the microscope did exist, and Dr. Kendall immediately made arrangements to visit Dr. Reif and to collaborate with him.
Reif was having his own difficulties. Despite enormous progress in his instrument refinements, he was having no success finding his proposed cancer microbe.
First, I began sectioning tissues of every known type of malignancy. I sectioned over 20,000 of those cut them down with a special microtome to very thin. Some of them were only a micron in thickness. I studied those under the microscope, and I eventually built my first high-powered microscope for the purpose of analyzing and checking those sections. The only result that I obtained over all those years was I succeeded in developing a very excellent technique of tissue preparation, but I never found an organism that I could say was a causative agent of malignancy.
So because Rife was unable to culture any of those so-called filterable organisms on his own, it was extremely fortuitous that he met Dr. Kendall, and Dr. Kendall brought his medium to Rife, and Rife brought his special microscope to Kendall. So this unique collaboration allowed them to do things that they couldn't do individually.
That instrument we used up until 1931. With that instrument, Arthur Kendall and I, working jointly in the Pasadena General Hospital, succeeded in isolating what we classify the first filterable form of bacteria ever seen. It was isolated from the Bacillus typhosus from cultures that Dr. Kendall brought from his laboratory in Northwestern University in Chicago. And we succeeded definitely in isolating a filterable form of that bacteria using a Kendall media. It's known as Kendall media. Now that is what Kendall used for the isolation or bringing out this Bacillus typhosus in the filterable state, which is published in the Californian Western Medicine in 1931, our joint report on that. We find that the Bacillus typhosus in its filterable state is a beautiful turquoise blue body. We see them swimming through the field. They're highly motile. The transformation, as you term it, or what we term the transitional state of these organisms, is accomplished by the media upon which we grow them. That's all. Because we can change these organisms readily by the media upon which we grow them, from one organism to another, as long as that organism belongs in the same category, or what we term the same group, as a series of organisms. What I believe is that some of these non-pathogenic organisms we have with us at all time, our metabolism changes those. The same as I say, I can take a colon bacillus. In 36 hours, I can make it into a typhoid bacillus by altering the media 2 parts per million per volume. Right now, with every damn known reaction of a typhoid bacillus clear down to the wheat-all reaction. Everything. The whole thing straight through. It sure doesn't sound like what I learned in biology.
By the end of 1931, Rife and Kendall had demonstrated that a filterable organism could be cultured out of the typhoid bacillus using K media as a nutrient, and that this and other filterable organisms could be seen glowing in their own natural color through a Rife microscope. Their findings were widely publicized, and it would have been difficult for any attentive bacteriologist to have missed the exciting news of this fundamental discovery in the field or its implications. The man who introduced Kendall and Rife, Dr. Milbank Johnson, understood the politics of science and medicine. He was well aware that Rife and Kendall's findings would not, in the end, be accepted by the mere weight of science journal articles. In 1931, there was only one Rife virus microscope in full operation, and that microscope stayed with Rife. Also, not only was K-media tricky to make, its use required considerable skill and patience. Johnson felt a demonstration was necessary. He held a dinner at his Pasadena mansion to honor Kendall and Rife and give the cream of America's medical scientists a first-hand look at their achievements. This well-attended occasion was announced as a dinner to celebrate the end of all disease. Following these developments came a simple blood test that could be used to diagnose patients with typhoid fever weeks before any symptoms arose. And Rife found the frequency that would destroy this microbe, or devitalize it, as Rife would explain. But it was not enough. Finally, the voice of conventional microbiology, the most powerful man in the field, Dr. Thomas Rivers of the Rockefeller Institute, spoke out against Kendall's findings. At a medical symposium in 1932 at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Rivers and his associate Hans Zinser of Harvard publicly challenged Kendall's filtration experiments, stating that they could not repeat them, and therefore the findings of Kendall were invalid. Not once in their discourse did Rivers or Zinser express any scientific curiosity toward this new microscope, a microscope that was introduced in the same papers that announced the isolation of the filterable forms. It was as if the scientific community didn't want to know about it, and this symposium marked the advent of official denial, to which the rank-and-file scientists of the day dutifully fell behind. But there were other microbiologists who were not swayed by Rivers' authority or the threat of his censure. Dr. Edward Rosenau, chief bacteriologist at the renowned Mayo Clinic, was a man who had become a pleomorphist as a result of his findings. Rosenau had discovered a pleomorphic relationship between the Streptococcus bacillus and the much smaller poliovirus. He sought out Rife and his microscope to help him confirm this relationship.
We isolated and worked on all of these different forms down through the line. I worked with Rosenau. He worked with me. I worked with him, whatever you call it, 14 years on poliomyelitis. He was the head of the Department of Research Bacteriology of Mayo's in Rochester, and he says they want me to scrap the work. I said, hold everything. I said, I'm coming back. We went through it. And he was a great theorist on Streptococcus. And of course, he worked almost entirely on endotoxins and vaccines. We produced all the symptoms of the disease in the lymphatic chain of the albino rabbit. I found the organism. Here's an article that's published in a Mayo Week, July 13th in 1932. It's right in there. You can see it. Rosenau wrote it. We went through. We ran this thing through. We showed them the motion pictures of the whole entire process. What did they do? They fired Rosenau. We was getting too close. You know, it's a terrible thing to talk like that, but I'm not bitter, but I'm sick of that curly stuff.
Now, I'll tell you this right now, and I may get shot later for saying it, but most microscopists, most people using microscopes in the United States, I'm not saying about Canada, Australia, any other country, but here in the United States, most of the microscopy that pathologists do, they are doing it at the very lowest level of technical skill that you can imagine. Although I will have to admit, things have improved a little bit in the last 10 or 15 years. But 40 years ago, most of the microscopy was very poor. It was just good enough that you could make a confident diagnosis. You could send that in, get it entered in the records, and you could send a bill out for it.
The lines are blurrier today than they were even at that time regarding microorganism developments. Because of new equipment, there's more that's seen than before. But what's happening is that all this emerging information is creating a revolution in the field. And now people are dealing with things that they didn't even know existed even 10 years ago. Mycoplasmas, nanobacteria, bacteria that are smaller than viruses. Right? People don't even know how to classify what they're looking at. It is such a chaotic soup. And there isn't a lot of money that goes into research around it. It's a highly undefined field. We're having to actually, there's been a language that's had to be invented even to talk about some of these things, to even name them.
Here's one thing you'll find, and you'll find it in years and years of experience, John, that it's an absolute true statement that I've found out over all the years I've worked with this work, and I've worked hard and sincerely and honestly. You'll find, by God, that 9/10 of the criticism is a cloak of ignorance. When they don't know themselves, then it ain't the voice.